There are 2 beds in this room, and she's in the one on the left. Hello, lovely people. It's good to have you here with me tonight. Wherever you are right now, bed, couch, somewhere quiet and a little dim, I'm glad you came. Settle in. We're going somewhere together, somewhere old, somewhere quieter than here. Picture a bedroom. Not your bedroom. A different one. Older. A little colder around the edges than you'd like. The year is somewhere in the 1880s, and the wallpaper is dark. A deep green, maybe, or a burgundy pattern, flowers and scrolls repeating themselves all the way up toward the ceiling. Heavy curtains are pulled tight against the night. There's a fireplace across the room, not quite roaring, just breathing. Orange and low, and on the mantelpiece a candle. It's been burning since before she came to bed. It's shorter now. It'll burn a little longer. She likes it that way. She likes watching the light move on the ceiling until sleep comes. There are 2 beds in this room. They sit a few feet apart. Matching, same dark wood headboards, same white linens, same modest height from the floor. She's in the one on the left. Her husband is in the one on the right. They said goodnight some time ago, pleasantly without ceremony, and neither of them found this strange at all, because it wasn't. Here's what most of us assume when we picture a Victorian couple in separate beds. We assume something went wrong. We assume distance, emotional, marital, some slow drift from warmth to courtesy. We assume this was the polite Victorian way of saying that something between them had gone cold, and almost every part of that assumption is wrong. The couple in separate beds, in the 1880s and 1890s and into the early 1900s, was not the sad couple. They were the progressive couple, the forward-thinking couple, the medically educated, fashionably modern, aspirationally refined couple. Sleeping apart wasn't a sign that a marriage had failed. It was a sign that it was doing very well, thank you, and that both people inside it had read enough to know better than to share a mattress. The double bed. The one we now associate with romance, with closeness, with everything a marriage should be. That was the backward choice. That was what people did when they didn't know any better, or couldn't afford to know better, which often amounted to the same thing. Think about that. The thing we've decided is the symbol of marital intimacy was, for a significant portion of history, the thing polite society was actively trying to leave behind. Before we go further, I want to say something. There's something about reading a comment that starts with a place and a time. It makes the whole thing feel less like a video and more like company. So if you feel like it, tell me where you are right now and what time it is there. That's the kind of comment I come back to, late at night, when everything else is done. Wherever you are, I see you. And if this kind of storytelling helps you wind down, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. It genuinely helps more than you know. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let the room get a little quieter around you. Picture that candle on the mantelpiece still burning in the bedroom we just stepped into. It'll be there when we come back to it. Let's begin. It's worth pausing before anything else to understand just how complete the reversal was. We live in a world that treats the shared bed as the obvious, natural arrangement for 2 people who love each other. The shared bed appears in every furniture catalogue, every film that wants to show you 2 people who belong together. It is so fundamental to our idea of marriage that we barely notice it anymore. But this default is not as old as we think. It is not as natural as we feel. And for a stretch of history that our great-grandparents would have recognized, it was specifically, deliberately, and enthusiastically being dismantled. The push for separate beds, for the twin-bed system, as it came to be called, gained serious momentum in the 1880s. This wasn't a fringe idea held by eccentrics. It moved through the middle and upper classes with the speed of an idea whose time had come, backed by doctors, endorsed by health reformers, and eventually sold, quite literally, by the most fashionable furniture makers in England. You could walk into Heel & Son on Tottenham Court Road in London in the 1890s and find matched twin bedsteads displayed prominently in their catalogues, not advertised as a compromise, not sold as a workaround for couples who'd fallen out, advertised as the modern choice, the progressive choice, the choice of people who understood that marriage, at its best, was a partnership between two individuals, each of whom deserved their own space, their own air, their own uninterrupted night. Maple & Company offered something similar. So did other retailers who understood that the well-off English household wanted to signal something through its furniture, and that what it wanted to signal in the 1890s was that it had arrived at a certain kind of enlightened domesticity. Ambrose Heel, the designer and retailer who had become one of the most influential figures in British domestic furniture, showed his work at the 1900 Paris exhibition. By then the twin bed had been aesthetically elevated. It wasn't just medically correct, it was beautiful, clean-lined, crafted, understated. The ornate carved mahogany beds of the earlier Victorian period gave way to something simpler. The twin bed became part of the arts and crafts sensibility, the idea that good design and good living were the same thing, which, as marketing goes, was not a bad move. But the furniture industry's role in the separate bed movement is worth pausing on, because it is more interesting than it first appears. Because the furniture industry was not simply responding to a trend that the doctors had created. It was, in a real sense, creating its own version of the trend, shaping it, giving it aesthetic language and price points, and the particular authority that comes from seeing a thing beautifully made and beautifully displayed. The Victorian furniture industry was undergoing its own transformation in the second half of the 19th century. The mass production techniques introduced by the Industrial Revolution had made furniture cheaper and more widely available than at any previous point in history. A family of modest means could furnish a home in the 1880s with items their grandparents could never have afforded. But this democratization of furnishing created a new anxiety among those who could afford better. How do you signal quality in a world where the things that used to mark quality are now available to everyone? The answer, in the furniture trade as in so many other industries, was design. Not just craft. Craft could be faked or approximated by machine production. But design, the choices that only people with taste made, for reasons that only people with taste understood. The clean lines of the arts and crafts movement, the carefully selected materials, the absence of the overwrought ornament that characterized mass-produced furniture, these were signals of a different kind of wealth than the old mahogany four-poster had been. Not inherited wealth, educated wealth, the wealth that had read the right books and made the right choices. The twin bed arrived at exactly the right moment to carry all of this signalling weight. It was simple in the way that the arts and crafts movement was simple. It was restrained in the way that the reform-minded middle class considered restraint to be more sophisticated than extravagance. It came in pairs, matched, coordinated, intentional. Owning twin beds announced not just that you had two beds. It announced that someone had thought about them, chosen them together, placed them in deliberate relationship to each other. This was the furniture of people who organized their domestic lives with care, and the catalogue was the mechanism by which all of this aspiration moved. This cannot be overstated. The Victorian trade catalogue was one of the most powerful marketing tools of the 19th century, and it is one that we have largely forgotten because we are so accustomed to digital shopping that the idea of poring over a printed book of available goods seems quaint. But for the Victorian middle-class household, the catalogue was the primary interface between the world of manufactured goods and the dream of what the home could be. Heel & Sons catalogues, in particular, were extraordinary objects in their own right. Ambrose Heel designed them as carefully as he designed the furniture within them. The typography was considered. The illustrations were detailed, sometimes technically detailed, showing joinery and construction alongside the aesthetic surface. The text was informative, not merely promotional. You felt, reading a Heel catalogue, that you were being treated as an intelligent adult making an informed choice, which is, of course, exactly what a very intelligent marketing strategy looks like. These catalogues circulated through households that could afford to buy from them, then through the households of their friends and acquaintances, then, in the way that aspirational objects always travel, through households that couldn't quite afford to buy, but study the pages with the quiet attention of people who intended to one day. The twin bed appeared in these catalogues not as one option among many, but as a featured item, a desirable item, an item that spoke well of the household that contained it. You have to imagine what it would have felt like in the 1890s to open the Heel & Son catalogue and see those matched twin bedsteads displayed on the page. Beautiful, simple, well made. And think, that is what enlightened people have in their bedrooms. That is what the bedroom of a modern marriage looks like. And then to close the catalogue and look at your own bedroom with its shared double bed and its accumulated associations with everything old-fashioned and unthinking about domestic life, and feel the particular Victorian anxiety of being behind, of not yet having arrived. This is how furniture moves, not because people are told to buy it, because people want to be the kind of people who own it. The psychological mechanism is identical to the one that sells wellness products today, or minimalist home decor, or whatever the current marker of a thoughtfully curated life happens to be. The specific objects change. The underlying movement, from aspiration to purchase to identity, does not. You have probably felt it. The sudden awareness that your home, your shelf, your morning routine is one version behind the version that the people with taste already have. The Victorians felt it too. They just felt it about beds. Victorian furniture was a language, and what the twin bed was saying in the 1890s was, we have thought about this. We are the kind of people who think about this. We have made the modern, progressive, medically sound choice, and our bedroom reflects who we are. That language is still being spoken, just with different objects. But underneath all of it, underneath the Heel & Son catalogues and the matched bedsteads and the aspirational anxiety, was an argument made not by furniture designers, but by doctors. And the doctor's argument is considerably stranger than the furniture. The medical argument got people thinking. The aesthetic argument got them to actually buy. And buy it they did. By the 1920s and 1930s, not even 50 years after this trend began, the twin bed had become so standard in middle-class British and American homes that it was essentially unremarkable. Magazines featured it without comment. Housing guides assumed it. Etiquette manuals didn't even need to recommend it anymore, because recommending it would have been like recommending that people use forks. It was just what you did. It is genuinely strange, if you sit with it, that we've so thoroughly forgotten this. The idea that two people who love each other should sleep apart seems almost radical now. the kind of arrangement you'd explain apologetically to house guests. But for the better part of 60 or 70 years, it was the conventional wisdom. It was what sensible people did. So what changed? And more to the point, why did it start? To understand that, you have to understand how the Victorians understood the body, because their model of human health was not ours. And within that model, sleeping next to another person was not a neutral act. It carried risk. The word they used most often was vitality. Your body contained a certain quantity of vital force, a kind of biological energy that powered everything: your strength, your mental clarity, your resistance to illness, your emotional steadiness. This vitality was not infinite. It could be depleted, and one of the ways it could be depleted, according to a significant strand of Victorian medical thought, was through prolonged physical proximity to another person while you slept. Simply put, a weaker person could draw upon the vitality of a stronger one, unconsciously, involuntarily, simply by sharing a bed. This sounds odd to us now. It sounded to many Victorians like obvious common sense. You've probably had the experience of waking up after a night next to someone who moved constantly or snored or ran hot, and feeling somehow more tired than when you went to sleep. The Victorian doctors had an explanation for that feeling. It wasn't just disrupted sleep. It was something being taken from you. Your vitality, flowing quietly across the mattress to someone who needed it more. The medical establishment had opinions. They were very confident. Most of them turned out to be wrong. But the consequence of those opinions, the actual, material consequence, lived out in thousands of bedrooms, was that couples began sleeping apart, believing genuinely that they were doing each other a kindness, that the most loving thing a husband could do was not crowd his wife's sleep. That love in practice looked like two beds. There's something in that I find quietly interesting. The intention was entirely right, even if the science was entirely wrong. People were genuinely trying to take care of each other. And now, the doctors behind all this, the ones who built the intellectual scaffolding for the twin bed movement, they deserve a closer look, because they weren't making wild claims in pamphlets. They were practicing physicians with real patience and real conviction, working within a framework that felt in its moment rigorous and modern and new. The Victorian understanding of the body drew on several traditions at once. There was first a version of classical thought, the ancient idea that the body's health depended on balance, on the careful management of its internal resources. And then there was something newer and more fashionable in the 19th century, a fascination with electricity and magnetism as biological forces. This wasn't pure fantasy. The discovery of electrical activity in the body, nerve impulses, muscle contractions, the measurable signals produced by the beating heart, was genuinely revolutionary in the 19th century. Scientists were demonstrating that living tissue conducted electricity, that nerves fired in patterns that looked almost like currents. The leap that medical thinking of this period made very eagerly, was from electricity plays a role in the body to bodies have electrical natures that interact with each other. If you are strongly positive and your spouse is strongly negative, the interaction might be draining. The wrong combination could produce over years of shared sleeping a slow and invisible exhaustion. What you had, in other words, was a theory of electromagnetic compatibility in sleep between married people. The Victorian home, at its most comfortable, was designed around the idea of separate spheres within it. The parlour was public, the dining room was ceremonial, but the bedroom, and especially the dressing room or boudoir that often adjoined it, was in principle entirely private, entirely hers, and within it a separate bed, or better yet a separate room, represented something that had almost no parallel anywhere else in a Victorian woman's life. It was space that was hers alone, not borrowed, not shared by courtesy, hers. And you have to understand what that meant in a world that gave women almost nothing else of the kind. The theory of electromagnetic compatibility wasn't applied equally. It wasn't gender neutral. Doctors and health writers of the period tended to describe women as the weaker sleeper, the one more vulnerable to the drain, the one whose delicate constitution was most at risk from a restless husband beside her. Men, by contrast, were the ones at risk of having their strength slowly borrowed. So the separate bed served different purposes depending on which side of it you were standing on. For a husband, it was a health precaution, a way of protecting his vitality, his productivity, his working self. For a wife, it was protection from the same in theory, but in practice it was something more. It was a door that she could close, not metaphorically, literally. If she had a separate room, which was the true aspiration, 2 rooms rather than simply 2 beds, she had a door. And a closed door meant something, in a Victorian household, that we might struggle to fully appreciate now. It meant no one could enter without knocking, not the servants, not the children, and not her husband. It meant she could wake at midnight, and many Victorian women did, practicing what was then a common and unremarkable pattern of broken sleep, and light her candle, and read, and write letters, and think, and not be observed doing any of it. This is a small thing on paper. In practice, for a woman of the Victorian middle and upper classes, it was nearly everything. Because here is what the rest of her life looked like. She was married, which meant that in the eyes of the law she had largely ceased to exist as a separate person. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She couldn't own property in her own name. She couldn't sign contracts. In most cases, she couldn't keep her own earnings if she had any. Her children were legally his. Her body, in the most uncomfortable sense, was his too. She was not without influence. She was not without intelligence or agency. Victorian women found ways to shape the world around them, through household management, through social networks, through the careful application of persuasion in a world that rewarded it. But the space she operated in was narrow, and it was public, in the way that anything observed is public. A separate bedroom was the exception to all of that. It was the one room in the house where she did not perform, where she was not a wife, or a mother, or a hostess, or a social asset, where she was simply herself at rest in the dark. Whether Victorian women thought of it in those terms, whether they articulated it that way to themselves or to each other, is harder to say. But the domestic advice literature of the period, and the diaries and letters of women who had that space and wrote about it, suggest that the private bedroom was understood at some level as a refuge, not from her husband specifically, from the relentless visibility of her role. And there is something else, something practical and slightly absurd and entirely Victorian in its logic. The separate bedroom wasn't just an idea, it was a necessity, and the reason had to do with servants. In a well-appointed Victorian household you did not dress yourself, you were dressed. A lady's maid attended her mistress through the complex business of the morning, the washing, the arranging of hair, the lacing of stays, the selection and fastening of layers of clothing that no one person could reasonably manage alone. This was intimate work, quiet work, work that happened in the private spaces of the bedroom and the adjoining dressing room. But the husband required the same kind of attendance, and the person who attended him, the valet, was male. You can see the problem. If a husband and wife shared a bedroom, you faced a logistical tangle that Victorian propriety was simply not equipped to handle. A male valet could not attend to the husband's morning routine in the presence of the wife. A female lady's maid could not move freely through the wife's dressing ritual in the presence of the husband. The entire elaborate system of domestic service, which was not a luxury but a structural feature of middle and upper class life, depended on being able to get the right servant to the right person in a space that was appropriately restricted. Separate rooms solved this problem cleanly. Each person could be attended in their own space by their own staff, without anyone seeing anything that propriety said they shouldn't see. The house ran more smoothly. The morning ran more efficiently, and everyone involved could maintain the very Victorian conviction that they were conducting their private lives with the appropriate degree of order and decorum, which, as logistical arguments go, has a certain tidiness to it. The most progressive domestic arrangement of the era was partly driven by the impossibility of sorting out whose lady's maid went where. But here's what makes all of this interesting, genuinely interesting, in the way that historical ironies tend to be. The servant argument, the health argument, the status argument, the autonomy argument, they all pointed in the same direction. Separate beds, separate rooms, separate space. And they pointed there for entirely different reasons. The doctor believed in it because of electromagnetic fields. The furniture maker believed in it because it sold. The woman of the house believed in it because, whether she said so plainly or not, a room of her own was the closest thing to freedom that her world would allow her. And her husband believed in it because he'd read the right pamphlets, and because a man who provided his wife with her own bedroom was the kind of man who thought about her comfort. And thinking about your wife's comfort was, in the 1890s, the mark of a civilized man. So you had a domestic arrangement that was simultaneously a medical prescription, a commercial product, a class signal, a feminist act that didn't call itself feminist, and an extremely practical solution to the problem of too many servants in too small a hallway. The Victorians were, if nothing else, efficient about their coincidences, and what held all of this together, the whole scaffolding of it, was the medical theory, the belief that shared sleep was genuinely physically dangerous, that the body at rest was vulnerable, that the sleeping couple was not simply two people in a bed, but two biological systems in constant invisible exchange. This belief deserved its own time, because the doctors behind it weren't characters or caricatures. They were real men, making real arguments, with real patients listening, and the world they described, the world in which sleep was a biological battleground, was the world that tens of thousands of couples were going to bed inside of, every single night, for decades. So let's go there. Let's sit with the doctors for a while, because what they believed is stranger and more interesting than anything a novelist would have invented for them. It is somewhere in the late 1870s. The gas lamps are lit, the evening is winding down, and a physician named Benjamin Ward Richardson is sitting at his desk, preparing yet another argument for something he has become increasingly convinced the world needs to hear. Dr. Richardson was not a fringe figure. He was a Fellow of the Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific body in Britain. He had a large practice, he was read, he was listened to, and he had, over the course of his career, developed a set of convictions about domestic life and physical health that he considered as rigorously grounded as anything else in medicine. One of those convictions was this: The double bed was killing people, not dramatically, not quickly, but steadily. Over years, the shared bed was doing its slow damage. And the mechanism, as Richardson understood it, was the breath. When you sleep beside another person, you breathe the same air they breathe, the air they exhale, warm, moist, carrying the invisible residue of their body's metabolic work, enters your lungs. You exhale your own warm, moist, residue-carrying air into the same small space. Over the course of a night, the air between you becomes, in Richardson's word, vitiated, contaminated, not fresh air, recycled air, breathed air. The kind of air that Richardson argued no healthy body should be filling itself with for 8 consecutive hours. He wasn't entirely wrong, by the way. In a small, poorly ventilated room, and Victorian bedrooms were often both, the air quality genuinely declined over the course of the night. This was a real phenomenon. What Richardson got wrong was the conclusion he drew from it. Because from shared air in a closed room is not ideal, Richardson and his contemporaries leapt, without sufficient pause, to, and also your spouse is draining your electromagnetic vitality through the mattress. These were separate arguments. They somehow arrived at the same prescription. Richardson advocated for what he called the single bed system. Not just separate beds. He preferred separate rooms entirely, or at minimum beds placed far enough apart that the couple's sleeping environments didn't meaningfully overlap. Air should circulate freely. Space should exist between them. The bedroom should function more like 2 individual sleeping quarters that happen to share a wall. He wrote about this with the earnest conviction of someone who had seen the evidence and followed the logic wherever it led. His patients were people. Their sleep mattered. Their health mattered. And if the evidence said that sleeping next to your spouse was bad for you, then the evidence needed to be followed, regardless of how inconvenient that was for the romance industry. Other physicians of the period approached the same question from a slightly different angle. Some were interested in the magnetic nature of the body, the idea that individuals possessed positive or negative magnetic orientations, and that sleeping beside someone of the wrong orientation could produce not just physical exhaustion, but what one writer described as a fretful temperament. The wrong bed partner didn't just tire you out. They made you irritable, anxious, somehow slightly wrong in yourself in ways that were hard to name but easy to feel. Most couples, these writers argued, would suffer from this drainage of vital forces without ever connecting it to the source. They'd wake up tired and not know why. They'd feel vaguely depleted and attribute it to overwork or poor diet or the weather. They wouldn't think to blame the person beside them, but that, according to this line of thinking, was exactly where the blame belonged. Think about what it meant in practice to tell a couple that the person you've chosen to share your life with is, by sleeping beside you, making you worse. Not through any fault of their own, not through any intention, simply by existing in your proximity while both of you are at your most vulnerable, unconscious, breathing, open to whatever the night carries. It was an intimate terror, if you believed it, and a lot of people did. William Whitty Hall, a health writer practicing in New York, offered what was perhaps the most practical formulation. He wasn't interested in electromagnetic fields or magnetic orientations. His prescription was simpler, and in its way harder to argue with. Every person, he said, required a single bed in a large, clean, light room, not necessarily separated from their spouse by an entire floor of the house, just their own bed, in a room with windows, with air that moved. The room should be large enough that the sleeper wasn't hemmed in, light enough that morning came in properly, and clean, genuinely clean, not the dusty, curtained, heavily furnished Victorian bedroom that was, in many houses, a monument to the idea that more fabric meant more comfort. Hall's vision of the ideal sleeping environment was almost aggressively modern for its time. Open windows, simple furniture, single bed, individual space. It sounds, if you describe it plainly, like something from a wellness magazine published last year, which is either a tribute to how far ahead of his time he was, or a reminder that the wellness industry has been selling the same ideas for a very long time under different names. Probably it is both. And then there was one writer of the period, Edwin Bowers, who put the whole argument into the single sentence that, once you've heard it, is very difficult to shake loose. Separate beds for every sleeper, Bowers wrote, are as necessary as separate dishes for every eater. Read that again. Every eater gets their own plate. Why would every sleeper not get their own bed? The analogy is so simple, so domestic, so completely reasonable on its surface that you have to actively resist it to find the flaw. Of course, you don't eat off someone else's plate. The idea is mildly disgusting when stated plainly. So why exactly, would you sleep in someone else's sleep? The argument was not, of course, unanswered. It never is, when something as intimate as sleeping arrangements becomes a subject of public debate. And it did become a subject of public debate, at least among the literate, publication-reading, opinion-having classes who had access to the periodicals and household journals that carried it. The dissenting voices tended to cluster around two objections. The first was practical. Who, exactly, could afford to sleep separately? The twin-bed system required either a large enough bedroom to accommodate two beds or two separate rooms. Either way, it required space, and space in the Victorian city was money. The reform was asking people to solve a health problem with an architectural resource that a significant portion of the population simply did not have. The doctors who recommended it were not as a rule the patients who couldn't afford it. This discrepancy was noted and occasionally said aloud, and then largely set aside, as discrepancies between what is good and what is possible tend to be. The second objection was emotional, and it was voiced more quietly, and usually by women, and usually in the kinds of publications that weren't quite the main journals, the letters pages of ladies' magazines, the personal columns of newspapers that specifically solicited correspondence from female readers. The objection was not medical and not architectural. It was simply this: I don't want to. Not phrased in these words. Victorian women didn't phrase things quite that directly in public print, but the sentiment was there, dressed in the language of sensibility or domestic preference or conjugal affection. A wife who wrote to say she and her husband had shared a bed for 30 years. She saw no reason to change. A correspondent who noted that she felt safer with her husband beside her. That the doctor's fears, however well-intentioned, had not troubled their health in the slightest. A woman who observed quite dryly that if the electromagnetic theories were correct, she and her husband were apparently an extremely compatible match. They had both remained perfectly well for 2 decades of shared sleeping. These letters were printed, they were read, and they were largely ignored by the advocates of the separate bed, who categorized them as sentiment interfering with science, which is the traditional position of a confident reformer faced with evidence that ordinary people are not terribly interested in being reformed. The social dynamics of the question were also, quietly, more fraught than the published debate acknowledged, because the separate bed, as a marker of progressive domesticity, created a particular kind of social pressure on households that didn't comply. Not overt pressure, Victorians were not overt about these things, but the pressure of implication. The well-meaning friend who mentioned that she and her husband had found the twin bed system absolutely transformative for their sleep. The magazine article, left casually in the parlour by a wife who wanted her husband to read it and draw his own conclusions. The new acquaintance who toured the house and paused, with some significance, at the marital bedroom and its single bed. For a couple of modest means who genuinely could not afford 2 beds, or the room to put them in, this social pressure added humiliation to poverty. The separate bed was not just an aspiration. It was a standard against which you could be found wanting, and in a social world organised around the careful management of how you appeared to others, being found wanting in the matter of your sleeping arrangements was not nothing. There was also the question of what the change actually meant within a marriage, not medically, personally. The doctor who prescribed separate beds was prescribing, whether he realised it or not, a change in the physical relationship between 2 people who had previously been, by the most literal measure, in contact every night. Sleeping beside someone is its own kind of intimacy, not sexual necessarily, but bodily. The warmth of them, the sound of their breathing, the knowledge of how they shift at 2 a.m. and what that sounds like and what it means. Taking that away, even with the best medical intentions, was taking something. Some couples found this a relief. Some found it a loss they couldn't quite articulate. Some found it neither, and simply organised their mornings more efficiently. The individual experience of the separate bed was, as individual experience always is, more complicated and more various than any argument for or against it could account for. But the argument itself kept going. It kept being made and reprinted and discussed and acted upon by the people with the means to act, and mostly ignored by the people without. And eventually, like most arguments, it ran out of energy, not because it was decisively refuted, but because the world changed in ways that made it irrelevant. This was the argument, this was the logic. And it moved through polite society with the easy confidence of a thing that couldn't be refuted, except that it could be, and it was, but not for another 50 years, and in the meantime, the furniture kept selling. The medical argument wasn't just abstract. It landed in people's lives in very specific ways. Because when a doctor tells you that your sleeping arrangement is damaging your health, you don't simply nod and forget it. You think about it the next time you wake up tired. You think about it the next time your spouse tosses beside you at 2 a.m. You think about it when the doctor's words come back in the dark, and the dark is very quiet, and the person beside you is breathing in the air you're about to breathe. Victorian anxieties about health were not mild. Tuberculosis, consumption as they called it, had, at its height earlier in the century, been responsible for the deaths of roughly 1 in 4 people in parts of Britain and America. By the 1880s the rate was declining, but it was still one of the most feared and most common causes of death. Cholera moved through cities in waves. Diphtheria took children. The germ theory of disease, the revolutionary idea that illness was caused by invisible organisms rather than bad air or moral weakness, was only just beginning to gain wide acceptance. And in that environment, the idea that your own bedroom might be a source of infection was not paranoid. It was, in the broadest sense, reasonable. You have to feel your way into this. Imagine living in a world where the people you loved, the people you shared your home and your food and your life with, regularly died of things you could not see. Imagine reading that Doctor, a credentialed Fellow of the Royal Society, had written with great care about how the air in a shared bedroom became contaminated over the course of a night. Imagine being a person who wanted deeply and sincerely to protect the person sleeping beside you. Separate beds would have felt in that moment like love, like the responsible expression of love, like choosing consciously and deliberately not to expose your spouse to whatever your body carried in the dark. This is the part that stays with me, not the wrong science, not the electromagnetic fields or the vitality theories, which are easy to dismiss now that we know better. The part that stays is the intention behind all of it, the genuine, careful, tender intention of people trying to take care of each other with the best tools they had. They were wrong about the mechanism, but they were right about wanting to protect what they had. And what they had by the 1880s and 1890s was the first generation that genuinely believed medicine could help. Not folk remedies, not prayer, not the blunt instruments of bleeding and purging that had defined medical practice for centuries. Actual, science-based medicine, derived from observation and evidence, practiced by trained professionals who had gone to medical schools and read the latest literature and kept up with the journals. This faith in medicine was new, it was hard-won, and it meant that when a doctor said something with sufficient authority, people listened in a way they simply hadn't before. The medical literature on sleep and bedroom hygiene circulated through precisely the networks most likely to act on it. Ladies' magazines, household management books, the popular health columns that had begun to appear in middle-class newspapers, the domestic advisors who were the Victorian equivalent of the wellness influencer, widely read, trusted, operating at the exact intersection of science and aspiration that gets people to actually change their behaviour. Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose book of household management, published in 1861, became one of the most widely read domestic guides of the century, devoted serious attention to the bedroom, ventilation, cleanliness, the importance of fresh air. These were not decorative concerns, they were presented as matters of life and death, because in the mid-Victorian period they were. You have to understand the role of the bedroom in the Victorian imagination of health. It was understood to be either a restorative space or a dangerous one. A bedroom with good ventilation, clean linens, and appropriate sleeping arrangements would restore the sleeper to health. A bedroom that was sealed, stuffy, overcrowded, or occupied in the wrong configuration would silently undo them. Night after night, year after year, the wrong bedroom was doing damage that the sleeper might not notice for decades, until they woke up one morning simply unable to recover, and no one quite knew why. This is the world in which Dr. Richardson's single bed system found its audience, not among the credulous or the foolish, among people who were paying attention. People who had watched family members sicken and die and wanted, with great urgency, to do whatever they could to prevent that happening again. The bedroom in this context was not just furniture, it was a health intervention, and the twin bed was the intervention available to anyone who could afford it, and had the sense to act on what they'd read. What the doctors couldn't have predicted, what no one in the separate bed movement anticipated, was that they were building an argument that would last exactly as long as the fear that animated it. When tuberculosis began to decline, when cholera retreated from the cities, when the germ theory had been absorbed and accepted and acted upon in ways that actually worked, the urgency that had made the separate bed feel necessary began to fade, and without the urgency, the arrangement was just an arrangement. Just 2 beds instead of 1. The question of whether you needed them suddenly looked different when the thing you were trying to prevent was no longer killing 1 person in 4, but that reckoning was still decades away. For now, in the 1880s and 1890s, the separate bed was the correct and modern and genuinely caring choice, and the people who made it did so with the full confidence of people who believe they've understood something important. The science was wrong, but the instinct behind it, to protect the people you shared your life with, was entirely right. And yet, and this is where Victorian medicine becomes genuinely complicated, the medical advice about sleep didn't land the same way for everyone. The concerns about tuberculosis and air quality were real across all classes, but the prescription, separate beds, separate rooms, individual sleeping spaces, was only achievable for some. The working classes of Victorian Britain were not sleeping in matched twin bedsteads selected from the Heel and Son catalogue. They were not consulting physicians about electromagnetic compatibility. They were sleeping in conditions that would be considered a public health emergency today, and the diseases that the middle classes were protecting themselves from with their twin beds were already in the working class bedroom and had been for generations, and there was no architectural solution to them. But we'll come to that, because the contrast between the separate bedroom and the tenement matters. It matters enormously for understanding what the separate bed actually meant, and who it was for and what it was protecting. That contrast deserves its own time. For now, let's stay in the middle-class bedroom. Let's stay with the woman who has, through a combination of medical fashion and domestic ideology, and a certain amount of quiet insistence, managed to secure a room of her own. Because what happened inside that room, what she actually did with that space, that privacy, those hours, is not what you might expect. It begins the way most nights begin. The house settles into itself. Candles are extinguished in the parlour, in the dining room, in the hallways. Servants move through their last duties, banking fires, checking locks, carrying the day's final tasks upstairs and down. The children are long since asleep, and she, the woman of the house, makes her way to her room, her own room. The word own is doing a great deal of work there. She's wearing what Victorian women wore to bed, not the diaphanous garments of later popular imagination, but something practical and layered, cotton or flannel depending on the season, covering her from neck to wrist to ankle, with a thorough modesty that her world required even in private. Her hair is down. This alone, the hair down, is a radical change from how she's moved through the day. Her hair in public, in front of anyone but her husband and her lady's maid, was always up, always dressed, always arranged to communicate something. Down, it is only hair, it is only hers. She sits at the dressing table. There is a candle, the same candle we saw at the beginning of this, the one that burns low on the mantelpiece and makes the light move on the ceiling. She can see herself in the mirror. She is alone. And then she might do something that surprises you. She might not go directly to sleep. Victorian women, like many people throughout most of human history before the industrial age, often didn't sleep the way we do. One long, unbroken block from dark to dawn. They slept in two pieces, a first sleep from roughly 10 or 11 at night until perhaps 1 or 2 in the morning. Then a quiet waking period of an hour or so. Then a second sleep until morning. Historians have documented this pattern across centuries and across cultures. It appears in medical texts, in diaries, in court records where people described what they were doing between sleeps. It was common enough to be unremarkable. It was simply how human bodies organized the night before artificial lighting, made staying up past dark effortless and 8 hours of continuous sleep a cultural expectation. For Victorian women, this waking hour, the hour between first and second sleep, was often the most private time of their entire day. Think about what her day had looked like up until that point. She had been, from the moment she woke, performing a role, managing the household, receiving callers, attending to her children, accompanying her husband to whatever social obligations the evening required. She had been visible, observed, evaluated, useful, all things that were expected of her, and that she did well, and that left almost no room for anything else. Now it was quiet. The house was dark. The servants were in their own rooms below stairs. Her husband was in his room, the door closed, asleep or close to it, and she was awake, in the candlelight, with an hour that belonged entirely to herself. She might read. Victorian women read voraciously, not just the improving literature that their world officially approved of, but novels, poetry, the kinds of books that were considered slightly frivolous or emotionally indulgent in daylight. In the quiet of the waking hour, frivolous was fine. No one was watching. She might write. Letters to friends, entries in a diary, the kind of private thought that Victorian women kept with extraordinary care and extraordinary discretion. The diaries that survive from this period are full of things that were never said aloud. Feelings about marriages that were adequate but not warm, about children who were loved but exhausting, about a self that existed somewhere underneath the performance and occasionally needed to be acknowledged. She might simply lie awake and think. This too was understood as valuable. Prayer, meditation, quiet contemplation. The Victorian world had a vocabulary for the restorative power of a mind left alone with itself in the dark. None of this required much. A candle, a book, a pen, a room, a closed door, the certainty that no one was going to knock. A separate bed gave her all of that. A shared one gave her none. And there is a detail from the domestic advice literature of the period, specifically from a book called The Lady's Dressing Room, published in 1893, that I keep returning to. The book was written by a French etiquette authority known as Baroness Staff, and it was widely read in both France and England. It covered the private practices of a well-appointed woman's life: hygiene, grooming, the management of the bedroom and dressing room, with the brisk authority of someone who considered these matters genuinely serious. What's striking, reading it now, is how insistently it argues for the importance of the dressing room as a space of personal development, not just grooming, not just the physical preparation for the day, but something closer to what we might now call self-care or self-cultivation, the deliberate tending of the inner life alongside the outer one. The dressing room, in Baroness Staff's vision, was where a woman returned to herself, where the noise and obligation of the day fell away, and what remained was the person underneath. This was, in 1893, a genuinely radical idea, even wrapped in the conservative language of etiquette. The idea that a woman had an inner life worth tending, that the private room was not just a room for grooming, but a room for being, that the closed door was not merely practical but necessary. She couldn't vote, she couldn't own property, she couldn't, in most circumstances, initiate a divorce, or keep her children if her husband chose to end the marriage, or practice a profession, or sign her own name to a legal document. But she could close that door, and sometimes that had to be enough. And yet, and here is the part that I find quietly remarkable, many Victorian women didn't just accept this arrangement. They understood it. They thought about it. They wrote about it in the careful, elliptical language of women who knew their letters might be read. The diaries of middle and upper-class Victorian women are full of references to the bedroom as a sanctuary. Not always stated plainly. The Victorians weren't plain about much, but present in the way that really important things tend to be present in private writing. A woman noting that she spent a quiet evening in her room with a book, another writing that she slept well, undisturbed. These phrases don't announce anything, but they accumulate into something. You can feel underneath them the relief, the specific relief of a space that is genuinely yours, the way your shoulders drop when you close a door behind you and know with certainty that no one is going to open it. You know this feeling. You've probably felt it today, the particular exhale of a moment that belongs only to you after hours of being available to everyone else. The Victorian woman felt it too. Her version was rarer and harder won, but it was the same exhale. And here is something I didn't know until I started researching this. Did you know that the concept of the boudoir was, in its origins, almost entirely about retreat? The word comes from the French bouder, to pout, to sulk, to be in a mood. The boudoir was, literally, the room you went to when you needed to feel your feelings without an audience. It was the room for being difficult, for being complicated, for being less than perfectly composed, that this room existed, that it was designed, furnished, sometimes lavishly so, and considered an entirely legitimate feature of a well-appointed home, tells you something interesting about the Victorian attitude toward female interiority. They weren't entirely comfortable with it, but they built a room for it, which is either deeply respectful or deeply condescending, depending on how you choose to look at it. Probably it is, as with most things Victorian, both at once. The boudoir and the bedroom, in houses large enough to contain both, functioned as a suite, a private territory that belonged to the woman of the house in a way that no other part of the home did. She might receive very close friends there. Her lady's maid moved freely through it, but no one else entered without invitation, not even her husband in the most finely calibrated households without some form of notice. And those close friends, the women who were invited into the bedroom suite while the husband was not, were doing something there that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Victorian middle-class woman had a public social life and a private one, and the gap between them was sometimes very wide. The public social life was managed, calling cards left and received, formal calls paid and returned, dinners attended and hosted, conversation kept within the carefully policed limits of what was considered appropriate for mixed company. The private social life happened in the bedroom suite, and it was often where the real thinking got done. Women visited each other in their private rooms with a freedom they didn't have in the parlour. There were no husbands to impress, no social performances to maintain, no requirement to be the version of yourself that the public world required. The visit to a friend's bedroom or boudoir was, in the Victorian social lexicon, a mark of genuine intimacy. Not the performed intimacy of the drawing room, but the actual intimacy of two people who trusted each other with the private version of their lives. What happened in those visits is imperfectly documented, for the obvious reason that imperfectly documented things are the ones conducted in private. But the letters and diaries of Victorian women give some sense of it. They talked about their marriages, they talked about their health, aspects of physical life that had no public language, things that couldn't be discussed with a doctor who was generally a man, without considerable awkwardness on all sides. They talked about books, the kinds of books that women weren't supposed to read too seriously or too publicly, lest it seem that they were neglecting their proper domestic focus. They talked about the small daily difficulties of lives conducted inside very tight constraints, and the strategies they'd developed for living within those constraints without being entirely consumed by them. This was, functionally, what we might now call mutual support. It was also, in some cases, something closer to intellectual exchange. The later Victorian period produced an extraordinary number of women who were conducting serious intellectual lives in private, reading philosophy, economics, history, science, without any formal credential or institutional affiliation, because those were not available to them, and without any public recognition, because that too was largely unavailable. The bedroom suite was where that private intellectual life could be shared, where you could mention that you'd been reading Herbert Spencer and find out what your friend thought of him, without anyone suggesting that Herbert Spencer was not quite the proper study for a woman of your station. There is a broader pattern here that social historians have documented. The private networks of Victorian women were, in some respects, more intellectually serious than the public culture gave them credit for. They operated parallel to the formal intellectual institutions, the clubs, the universities, the societies, from which women were excluded. They circulated books and ideas and opinions through the networks of friendship and visiting that made up their social lives. And much of this circulation happened in the private rooms of houses, where the conversations were freer and the stakes were lower than they'd have been anywhere else. The separate bedroom and the private suite around it was the infrastructure for this. The room that the medical establishment justified on the grounds of electromagnetic vitality, and the furniture makers sold on the grounds of modern taste, was also the space in which Victorian women conducted a substantial portion of their intellectual and emotional lives. Not because anyone planned it that way, because it was the only space they had, and they used what they had, and the human capacity to find meaning and connection and genuine life in whatever space is available to it, is one of the most reliable things about people. None of the doctors writing about separate beds in the 1880s were thinking about this. None of the furniture catalogues mentioned it. Baroness Staff came closest, with her insistence on the dressing room as a space of personal cultivation, but even she was describing individual practice rather than collective life. The collective life of women in their private rooms was simply assumed, the way the most important things often are, present and unremarked, too ordinary for the people inside it to find it worth documenting, and therefore visible to us only in glimpses through the letters and diaries that survived by chance. But it was there. It was real. An understanding that the separate bedroom was also a social institution, not just a personal sanctuary, but a space where the private life of Victorian women happened collectively, in the company of other women who were living the same compromised, constrained, often unexpectedly rich life, changes how the whole thing looks. The twin bed was not just a piece of furniture. The room around it was not just a room. They were, together, the architecture of a life that had to be lived in ways the public world did not quite see. This last point is worth sitting with. In a marriage where the wife had essentially no legal standing, no financial independence, and no formal authority over her own body, the bedroom, and the custom of knocking before entering it, represented one of the very few spaces in which her preference carried actual weight. He knocked. She could choose not to answer. Whether this ever actually happened, whether a Victorian wife ever simply did not answer when her husband knocked, is the kind of thing that doesn't end up in the historical record. But the custom existed. The expectation existed. And the existence of an expectation, even one that was often broken, tells you something about what people understood to be right. I had no idea before I started looking at this how much quiet architecture there was around the Victorian woman's sleeping space. How many small conventions and customs and pieces of domestic advice were, when you look at them together, all pointing in the same direction. This is her space. Respect it. It wasn't feminism. It wasn't rights. It was closer to something like a gentleman's agreement, a set of unwritten rules that acknowledged, without quite saying so, that a woman needed something that the law wouldn't give her, and that no one was prepared to argue for openly. So they gave her a room, and they agreed, informally, to knock. There is a word the Victorians used for this kind of unspoken mutual understanding: propriety. It's usually translated as prudishness, as excessive formality, as the repressed cousin of actual freedom. But propriety was also sometimes a container for things that had nowhere else to go. Rules that protected people who couldn't protect themselves by any other means. The Victorian woman who lay awake in her own room at 1 a.m, reading by candlelight, thinking thoughts she wouldn't repeat to anyone. She was inside a structure of propriety that had, in this one particular area, left a gap just large enough to breathe in. The candle on the mantelpiece, the door closed, the house quiet around her. That image, which is also the image of sleep, of rest, of the night settling into itself, is the one I keep returning to, because it contains both things at once, the limitation that required it and the peace that it made possible. And tomorrow morning, that peace would end. At 6 or thereabouts the knock would come. Not her husband's knock, a lighter knock, her lady's maid with the day's first fire, with warm water, with the long and intimate process of putting her back together for the world. And that morning ritual, the one that took place in this same private room, with this same woman, in the careful hands of a servant who knew her more closely than almost anyone, is a story all by itself. Because the morning after the separate bed is where you discover what the separate bed actually cost, and what it made possible, and who was really at the centre of it all. Let's begin with the knock. It is just past 6 a.m, and you are in the bedroom. Your bedroom, not shared, not borrowed, yours. The fire went out sometime in the small hours. The room is cold in the way that Victorian rooms were cold. Not the dramatic chill of the outdoors, but the damp, still cold of a space that has been sealed against the night. The curtains are heavy. No light comes through them yet, or only a thin line of grey at the edges where they don't quite meet the wall. You're not fully awake. You're in that state, familiar enough even now, where consciousness has arrived but the body hasn't caught up yet, where the weight of the bed is still more compelling than anything the day is offering. And then the knock, not loud, not insistent, just present. The particular knock of someone who is doing this every morning and has learned precisely how much force is required to be heard without being startling. 2 soft raps, a pause, the door handle moving. Your lady's maid has arrived. She's probably younger than you. She's been awake since 5, or earlier. She's already dressed herself, quickly, practically in the dark. And she's carried hot water up from the kitchen in a heavy ceramic jug, because this house does not yet have indoor plumbing on the upper floors, or if it does, the water that comes from it is not reliably hot at 6 a.m. She has done this every morning. She will do it again tomorrow. She does it without complaint, or at least without complaint that you will ever hear. She sets the water jug on the washstand. She goes to the fireplace and kneels. The fire is laid from the night before. Coal and kindling arranged by the housemaid whose job includes doing this before she goes to bed. And your lady's maid lights it now. The match, the first catch of flame. The small particular sound of coal beginning to take. That soft crumbling and catching that is one of the most domestic sounds that has ever existed. The room begins, very slowly, to warm. This is where the separate bedroom earns its keep in the most literal possible sense. Because what is about to happen, the long, intimate, systematic process of your morning, cannot happen in a shared space. It requires privacy. It requires the particular kind of privacy that only a room with a closed door provides, and your lady's maid is about to demonstrate exactly why. She has already drawn back the heavier outer curtains, just enough to let the grey morning light begin to define the room. The washstand is set. The water jug sits beside a smaller bowl, and beside the bowl a cloth, a cake of soap, a towel warmed, somehow, despite everything, that she managed to hang near the kitchen fire before carrying it up. You don't know exactly how she arranges these things. You don't need to. She does. The washing comes first, not a bath. Baths were not daily events in the Victorian household, requiring as they did the boiling and carrying of a great quantity of water, the preparation of the tub, the attendance throughout. Baths were weekly, usually. What the morning offered was something more modest. A thorough washing of the face and hands, a careful attention to the parts of the body that had been enclosed all night, with warm water and soap, and the quiet efficiency of a woman who has been trained to treat this process with both discretion and speed. There is no small talk. Not yet. The morning ritual had its own rhythm, and that rhythm began in near silence. She washes. You are washed. The distinction between those two things, between doing and being done to, is one of the more unusual features of this life, if you think about it from the outside. From the inside, it is simply how mornings work. Then the hair. This is the part that takes longest. Victorian women's hair was long, often very long to the waist or beyond. It was dressed in elaborate arrangements that required not just skill but patience, and not just patience but a detailed knowledge of this particular woman's hair, its weight, its tendency to curl or not curl, the way it behaved in damp weather, which in England was most weather, the pins it preferred, the style her husband liked, which might or might not be the same as the one she liked. Navigating that distinction was part of the unspoken curriculum of being a lady's maid. Your lady's maid knows your hair better than you do. She's been working with it every morning for however many years she has been in your service. She knows which sections need more pinning, which always escape before noon, which arrangement gives you a headache after 2 hours if the pins sit wrong. This knowledge, this specific, bodily, intimate knowledge of you, is something no one else in your life possesses. Not your husband, who sees the result but not the process. Not your mother, who knew a younger version of this hair. Only her. The relationship between a Victorian woman and her lady's maid was one of the more complicated intimacies of the era. Not friendship, exactly. The class distance was too substantial for that, and both women understood it. Not simply employment either, because the nature of the work was too close, too physical, too daily for that framing to hold entirely. It was something without a clean name, a kind of trusted proximity. She knew when you were unwell before you admitted it to anyone else. She could see the pallor of your face, feel the tension in your shoulders before the corset went on. She knew when the marriage was strained, because the morning silences changed character, quieter in a different way, tighter, the kind of quiet that has something compressed inside it. She knew things about your body that your husband did not know, because the morning ritual included parts of your physical self that were never visible to him, and she kept all of this, professionally discreetly, with the particular silence of someone who understands that the value of what they know lies partly in never saying it aloud. Now the corset. This is the moment that has acquired an outsized reputation in the popular imagination. The image of the Victorian woman being laced into an instrument of torture, gasping, ribs shifting under the pressure. The reality was more complicated and considerably less dramatic. Corsets in the Victorian period were not, for most women, the extreme garments of caricature. They were structured undergarments, boned with whalebone or steel, designed to support the torso, to distribute the weight of the skirts and petticoats that hung from the waist, and to create the fashionable silhouette of the period. They were worn from girlhood. The body accommodated them over years. Most women who wore corsets regularly reported no particular discomfort. They were, in the way of all things you've worn since childhood, simply part of what a body felt like. What's more striking, if you look at the actual medical literature of the period, is that many doctors specifically endorsed corsets as back support. The same physicians who were campaigning against shared beds were, in some cases, recommending stays to women with weak spines or poor posture. The Victorian medical establishment had opinions about women's bodies. They had many opinions. They held them all with great confidence. The tight lacing that caused genuine harm, the deliberate reduction of the waist to 18 or 16 inches through extreme constriction, was practiced by a small minority, largely fashion-conscious young women, and was criticised by many of their contemporaries as much as by ours. It was not, despite what the images suggest, how the average Victorian woman spent her mornings. What the corset did do, for all women, in all its forms, was require help to put on. The laces were at the back. You could not reach them yourself. You needed someone behind you, pulling evenly on both sides, adjusting the tension, checking that everything sat correctly before the layers went on top of it. You needed your lady's maid. After the corset, the petticoats. Victorian women in the middle decades of the era wore several of them, sometimes 4 or 5 in different fabrics, creating the volume that the skirts required. Each one was a separate garment, tied or hooked at the waist, layered with care in the correct order. Then the dress itself, almost always hooked or buttoned at the back, in the same way that the corset laced. Impossible, or nearly so, alone. By the time you're dressed, hair arranged, corset laced, petticoats layered, dress fastened, the small finishing touches of jewellery and gloves and whatever the day required, the better part of an hour has passed. The fire in the grate has caught properly now. The room is warm. The grey light outside has shifted towards something that might, if the English weather cooperates, become actual morning, and you are ready. But only because she made you ready. Here is what the separate bedroom made possible in practical terms. Your husband's valet was doing exactly this same thing, at exactly this same time, in exactly the room across the hall. Going through exactly the same slow, intimate, back-of-the-wardrobe business of making a person presentable. And the reason this was possible without anyone violating any rule of propriety, the reason neither set of servants encountered the other person in a state of undress, and neither husband or wife had to navigate the presence of the wrong servant in their private mourning, was that there were 2 rooms, 2 doors, 2 separate territories, each with its own attendant. The architecture solved the problem that Victorian society had created, and the problem Victorian society had created was, at its root, a problem about the body, about who could see it, and when, and under what circumstances. The body at its most unguarded, waking, unwashed, undressed, being dressed, was a body that required careful management. The bedroom walls and the doors within them were part of that management. Some Victorian homes took this further than others. The grandest houses had servant corridors running parallel to the main corridors, separate staircases, separate passages, specifically so that servants could move through the house without being seen by the family or guests. The servant world and the family world occupied the same structure, but moved through different paths within it. They were separated by walls so thin you could hear a voice through them, and by social distances so vast they might as well have been on different continents. The separate bedroom fit into this architecture naturally. It was one more wall, one more managed boundary, one more arrangement designed to keep bodies in their proper relationship to each other and to the people who attended them. And it worked, in the way that all Victorian arrangements worked, imperfectly, with considerable labour, and with the total cooperation of everyone involved in maintaining the fiction that this was simply how things were done. Which brings us to the part of the story that the separate bedroom cannot explain. The part that lives in a different house entirely, not the townhouse with its service corridors and matched twin bedsteads, but the tenement, the single room, the place where 10 people slept in the space you use for getting dressed. But before we go there, before we leave this room entirely, I want to stay with it a moment longer, because there is one more thing the separate bedroom did, and it is the thing least often mentioned in the histories, and the one I find most quietly significant. It protected a marriage, not in the way the doctors meant, not by preventing the drainage of electromagnetic vitality, in a simpler, more human way. By giving two people who had to share their entire lives enough space to be occasionally themselves, enough space to be tired without it being witnessed, enough space to be unwell without it becoming a conversation, enough space to exist in that unguarded state. No performance, no presentation, just a person in the dark, without asking another person to witness it every single night. The Victorians understood something that we occasionally forget in our enthusiasm for togetherness. Proximity without any relief from proximity is not intimacy. It is exposure. And exposure, over time, without the privacy that makes intimacy feel chosen rather than required, can wear things down in ways that are very slow and very hard to name. Think of what it meant to meet your spouse at the breakfast table, having both slept well and separately. You had spent the night as yourself. You had woken and been attended to in your own space. You had organised yourself, internally, privately, before walking downstairs. And the person who stood up from their chair and kissed your hand or your cheek had done the same. They were refreshed. You were refreshed. And the greeting, small as it was a genuine one. Not the half-asleep acknowledgement of two people who had spent the night pressed together, but an actual meeting. Two people choosing to be in the same room. There is something in this, something that modern relationship research has rediscovered under different vocabulary, about the importance of having a self to bring to your relationship. The separate bed was, in effect, a technology for preserving that self, for protecting every night the part of each person that belonged only to them, so that what they brought to each other in the morning was something real, not performance, not the exhausted residue of proximity, but presence, offered freely by someone who had spent 8 hours being no one's anything and was now choosing to be here. The couple who met at the breakfast table, having both slept well in their own spaces, had something to offer each other. They were, in some small but real sense, refreshed for the encounter. They had been, for 8 hours, separate people, and two separate people choosing to be together is a different thing from two people who've never had the choice. There is something in that I find genuinely worth holding on to, not as an argument for separate beds in the modern sense. We found other ways to navigate this, or we tried to. But as a reminder that the arrangement wasn't only cold logic or medical anxiety, somewhere inside it was a real understanding of what people needed from each other and what they needed from themselves. before they could be any good to anyone else. The lady's maid has finished. You are dressed. The room is warm. The fire settled into its mid-morning rhythm, and outside the window the day has begun without you. You will go downstairs now. You will be the person the day requires. The door closes behind you. The room is yours again, for tonight. Now, let us go somewhere else entirely. Not upstairs, down. Past the servant corridors, past the basement kitchen with its permanent smell of coal and boiled cloth, out the back of the house, and into the city that surrounds it. A city that in 1880 or 1890 was growing faster than anyone had a plan for. A city into which hundreds of thousands of people had poured from the countryside over the previous 50 years, looking for work in the mills and the factories and the docks, and finding it, but finding very little else. The streets we are walking into now are not the streets of Belgravia or Kensington. They are the streets of Whitechapel, of Bermondsey, of the rookeries that had been slowly cleared by reform but not entirely gone. Streets that Henry Mayhew wrote about in the 1850s and 1860s, documenting what he found there with the careful eye of a journalist who understood that the city contained many cities, most of them invisible to each other. What Mayhew found, what Charles Booth would document in even greater detail in his systematic poverty surveys of the 1880s and 1890s, was a world in which the concept of a private bedroom was as distant as the concept of a private ocean. A single room. This is where we begin. A room perhaps 12 feet by 10. Inside it, a family. Not a small family by our standards. Victorian working-class families were large, partly from necessity, partly from the absence of reliable contraception, and partly from the simple reality that children were labour, and labour was survival. 5 children. 6. Sometimes 8 or 9 or more, plus the parents, possibly a lodger because the rent was 2 shillings and 6pence a week. 2 shillings and 6pence was exactly what a labourer's daily wage did not cover. Taking in a lodger made the difference between the room and the street. In this room, a bed. Possibly 2, if the family had accumulated enough to justify the space they took. The parents in one, the children in the other, or on a straw pallet on the floor, or arranged across the bed in the perpendicular manner that poor families had perfected over generations. Bodies laid sideways, head to foot, fitting 4 or 5 children into a space designed for 2 adults. The youngest sleeping beside the mother because she needed to feed the youngest at night, and moving across a room in the dark to do this was one obstacle more than the night needed. Privacy in this space was not a concept. It was not an aspiration. It was not a word anyone in this room would have used about sleeping, because privacy in sleep required a door, and a door required a room, and a room required rent, and rent was the thing that organised every decision in this household, from the first of the month to the last. The bed itself, whatever the bed was shared not from preference or medical theory, or anything as luxurious as choice, but from the arithmetic of survival. More bodies in a bed generated more warmth, and warmth in an unheated room in an English winter was not comfort. It was health. It was the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up. There is a detail from the social survey literature of this period that I want to give you, because it tells you something that no general description quite can. Researchers documenting London's poor in the 1880s found households where the family owned no bed at all, where they slept on the bare boards of the floor, wrapped in whatever clothing they owned, where the children slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, because there was no other clothing, and washing the only clothing they owned required them to have nothing to wear while it dried, which in an English autumn was a risk no one could afford to take. The separate bed was not, for these families, a question of progressive medicine or domestic ideology or the management of servant logistics. The separate bed was another world, a world they could see occasionally through the windows of houses they passed on the way to and from work, a world as remote from their own as the Heel and Sun catalogue might as well have been published in a foreign language. This distance, the distance between the twin bedsteads of Tottenham Court Road and the straw pallet of Whitechapel, is the distance that the separate bedroom was also silently marking, not deliberately, not with any intention to exclude, but marking it nonetheless, the way all luxury marks its opposite without meaning to, simply by existing. And at the very bottom of even this world, below the tenement, below the shared room, below the straw pallet on the floor, was something that I find genuinely difficult to hold in the mind, even now, even knowing it, the twopenny hangover. For 2 pennies, a person in the very lowest reaches of Victorian London could buy the right to spend a night in a common lodging house. Not a room, not a bed, a rope. The proprietor would string a length of thick rope horizontally across the room, roughly at chest height. The night's customers would lean their arms over it. Their bodies would hang forward, head drooping, held partially upright by the rope across their chest. This is where they would sleep, or do what they could do that approximated sleep, for as many hours as the money allowed. In the morning, before dawn, the proprietor would untie one end of the rope and drop it. Everyone leaning on it fell forward simultaneously. That is the end of the night. You stand up, you go back out into the street. 2 pennies. You have to let that sit for a moment. Because in the same city, at the same time, a furniture maker on Tottenham Court Road was selling matched twin bedsteads for 20 or 30 shillings a set, and a physician in a consulting room on Harley Street was advising his patients that their electromagnetic vitality was at risk from sleeping too close to their spouse. These things were happening in the same place. They were, in every meaningful sense, the same world. And yet they were so far apart that the word same barely holds. The Industrial Revolution had done something very specific to how the working classes slept. It had not just taken their space and their privacy. Those were already scarce before the factories came. It had reorganized the night itself. The old pattern of segmented sleep, the first sleep, the waking hour, the second sleep, depended on the freedom to wake at midnight and simply be awake for a while. A labourer who started work at 5 or 6 in the morning, who worked 12 or 14 hours in a factory or at a dock, who came home to a room with 5 other people in it, did not have a gentle midnight hour for reading and prayer and private thought. He had exhaustion. She had the youngest child's needs in the dark. The night was not a sanctuary, it was a gap between 2 forms of labour. Henry Mayhew understood this. In his surveys of London's street people and labouring poor, published across the 1850s and 1860s, he documented what sleep looked like at the very bottom of Victorian society, with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. What people ate, what they earned, how they moved through the city that owned them and did not see them. What he found, among other things, was that sleeping rough, what we now call homelessness, existed in elaborate gradations. There was the common lodging house, with its shared dormitories and rope arrangements. There was the penny sit-up, a room where for a penny you could sit in a chair for the night, not lie down, not stretch out, just sit. There were the casual wards of the workhouse, where the destitute could apply for a night's shelter in exchange for a morning's labour. Stone breaking, oakum picking. the deliberately punishing work designed to discourage all but the genuinely desperate from using the system. And below all of these was the open arch, the doorway, the warmth of a baker's vent rising from the pavement, the things that cost nothing because there was nothing left to pay with. The working class woman in all of this, the woman who is the counterpart of our Victorian lady in her private bedroom, slept where she could. She shared whatever was available with however many people needed it. She had no lady's maid, no washstand with warmed water, no private fire lit at 6 by someone whose job was her comfort. She had the morning as it came, cold, shared, already in motion. What she did have, and this is the part that gets lost in the contrast, was a kind of intimacy with the people around her that the separate bedroom was specifically designed to avoid, a different kind of closeness, not chosen, not comfortable, but real. The working class household slept together, woke together, heard each other's coughs in the night, felt each other's warmth. The private middle-class bedroom, in protecting its occupant from exactly that kind of exposure, was also protecting her from exactly that kind of connection. This is not a sentimental point. I am not suggesting that poverty was cosy, or that the tenement had things the townhouse lacked in ways that made up for anything. It didn't. The separate bedroom was, by every measure, better. Warmer, cleaner, quieter, healthier. The working-class family sleeping 6 to a room was not experiencing a more authentic form of togetherness. They were experiencing poverty. But the separate bed meant something partly because of this. It meant that you had enough space, enough money, enough distance from the kind of life where bodies pressed together not from love but from necessity. The separate bed announced, "I have escaped that, not cruelly, not loudly, but unmistakably." And here is the irony that the whole era was too busy living to notice. The working classes, packed together in their single rooms, were sleeping in almost exactly the way that the Victorian medical establishment was advising the middle classes to sleep. Together, warm, sharing breath and space, and the accumulated animal comfort of proximity. The doctors were recommending against what the poor had no choice but to do. The poor were doing, out of necessity, what the rich were being told was dangerous. The rich, meanwhile, were paying for the privilege of sleeping alone. Nobody was in a position to find this funny, but it is, in a dark and specific way, quite funny. There is one more dimension to the working-class sleeping experience that the middle-class reformers barely touched. Not out of callousness, but out of a failure of imagination that was, in its own way, structural. Because the working-class household did not just sleep differently, it experienced night differently, time differently. The very shape of rest was different. Charles Booth's Survey of London Poverty, published in 17 volumes between 1889 and 1903, is one of the most extraordinary documents in social history. Booth and his team of researchers visited tens of thousands of households across the city, recording income, occupation, living conditions, and the texture of daily life with a precision that had never been attempted before. What they found, among other things, was that poverty reorganized every hour of the day, including the hours that were supposed to be private. In a household where work began at 5 or 6 in the morning, sleep did not happen at 10 at night. It happened whenever the body gave out, sometimes at 8, sometimes at 9, sometimes across a stolen hour in the afternoon when the children were briefly quiet. Sleep was not a ritual. It was a collapse, and it was interrupted constantly by the youngest child, by a neighbour's noise through the thin wall, by the simple reality that bodies pressing close together in an unventilated room generated heat that made deep sleep difficult even when exhaustion made it necessary. The irony that the doctors were recommending against something that the working classes were doing out of necessity is only half the story. The other half is that the working classes were not in fact doing it well. They were not sleeping deeply, or restorative, or in the way that the segmented sleep theory described as natural. They were sleeping badly, in difficult conditions, without the resources to do anything about it. The shared bed was not a choice about intimacy. It was a symptom of poverty. And yet, and this matters, the people in those beds were not, on the whole, making a special study of the problem. They were sleeping, in the way that people sleep when they're tired and the night is the night and the bed, such as it is there. The philosophical question of whether they'd prefer a room of their own was not one that organised their thinking. The practical question of whether there'd be enough bread in the morning was. What Booth's researchers found, reading between the lines of their careful tables and maps, was that the working-class household had developed a different relationship with sleep, less private, less ceremonial, less the elaborate ritual of preparation and recovery that the middle-class separate bedroom represented, and more simply the end of the day. The night was not a sanctuary. It was just the dark part before morning. This matters because it tells you something about what the separate bedroom was actually protecting. Not sleep, exactly, not rest in the physiological sense, but the experience of sleep as meaningful, as personal, as something that happened to you specifically, in your space, in your way. The middle-class separate bedroom was a machine for making sleep feel like it mattered, like you mattered enough for it to have conditions and privacy and a ritual around it. For a quarter of the population, sleep was what happened when your body stopped moving. For another quarter, it was a carefully managed experience that required matching furniture and a lady's maid and a physician's approval. This is the distance the separate bed was marking, and it is not a small distance. The separate bed was, then, all of these things at once: a medical precaution, a commercial product, a class signal, a feminist act without a name, a logistical solution to the problem of servants, and a quiet statement of distance from the tenement world below. It was all of those things braided together in a piece of furniture that most people climbed into every night without thinking about any of it. Which brings us to one final, perfect irony. The most famous Victorian in the world, the woman whose name we use to define the entire era, whose image of rigid propriety and domestic correctness we have inherited as the defining portrait of the age, did not sleep in a separate bed. She never had. Her name, of course, was Victoria, and her bedroom tells a story that contradicts almost everything the separate bed movement stood for, and almost everything we think we know about the woman at the centre of it all. It is the 1840s, Buckingham Palace, a room that is, by any measure, one of the most private spaces in England, the private bedroom of the reigning monarch. And in that room, one bed, not two. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert shared a bedroom throughout their marriage. Not by accident, not by oversight, not because they hadn't read the right pamphlets. By choice. By deep, documented, frequently expressed preference. Victoria kept a diary. She was a prolific and candid diarist, and her entries about Albert are not the careful, public-facing entries of a monarch managing her image. They are the entries of a woman in love with her husband, writing privately about what that love felt like, the physical warmth of him, the comfort of his presence, the particular grief of mornings when duties separated them early. This was not a woman who believed in electromagnetic compatibility. This was a woman who wanted to sleep next to her husband and did, and was glad of it. Victoria was 20 years old when she married Albert. She was, by her own account, not prepared for what happened inside a marriage. The intimacy of it, the physical reality of it, the way two people's daily lives collapsed into each other, in ways that the formal ceremonies of courtship had given no indication of. She found it, almost immediately, wonderful. Her diary entries from the first weeks and months of her marriage are startling in their directness. She wrote about Albert with the unguarded warmth of someone who had not yet learned to temper her feelings for public consumption, which, given that she was also the Queen of England, gives you a sense of how entirely genuine those feelings were. She was not a cold woman. She was not a distant woman. The image of Victoria as a monument to repression, a figure of severe black bombazine and compressed grief, is the image of her later years, and even that image, if you look at it honestly, is less repression than the specific and total devastation of a woman who lost the person she wanted most in the world. Prince Albert died on the 14th of December 1861. He was 42 years old. The illness, probably typhoid fever, though the diagnosis has been questioned, came on quickly and ended faster than anyone around him fully prepared for. Victoria was with him. She was told he was gone. She did not, in any conventional sense, recover. What happened next tells you more about the private woman behind the public monument than almost anything else in the historical record. Victoria had a plaster cast made of Albert's face, and of his hands. These casts she kept with her, not as objects of mourning, not displayed in some formal way, but as things she returned to, things she wanted near her. She kept a cast of his right hand beside her in the bed, for the rest of her life. Every night, for 40 years, the woman who defined an era lay down beside the shape of her dead husband's hand. These sheets on his side of the bed were changed daily, as if he were still using them. A basin of warm water was brought to his dressing room each morning, as if he still needed to wash. His shaving equipment was laid out. The routine of his presence was maintained long after the presence itself was gone, by servants who understood that this was not eccentricity but grief, and that grief required something to do with its hands. Windsor Castle kept the rooms as Albert had left them. Buckingham Palace did the same. The instructions left to the household staff specified that the rooms where Albert had lived and worked and slept should be maintained, dusted, aired, tended, indefinitely. Victoria would die in 1901, 40 years after him, and the rooms were still being kept. She slept with his nightgown arranged beside her, the one he had worn in his final weeks. She wore a cast of his hand on a chain around her neck. When she died, she was buried with a plaster cast of his hand and a lock of his hair, and beside her body were placed photographs and other objects that her instructions specified, items she had assembled across 4 decades, with the systematic devotion of someone building a world to live in when the actual world had become uninhabitable. Take a moment with that. The most powerful woman in the world, queen of the largest empire in human history. A woman whose face appeared on the currency of 1/3 of the globe, and what she wanted, in the dark, after the lights were out and the servants had gone and the day's impossible weight of duty was done, was the shape of his hand. This is the story that the separate bed movement cannot account for. Not because the movement was wrong about everything, it wasn't, but because human beings don't, in the end, sleep according to theories. They sleep according to what they need, and what Victoria needed was the thing she'd had and lost. Not electromagnetic compatibility, not individual vital force, the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a particular person. Her grief made her unusual, but her need did not. And understanding that, in the context of everything we've looked at, changes the whole picture slightly. There is a room at Windsor Castle called the Blue Room, named for the colour of its earlier furnishings, though it had been redecorated more than once in Victoria's lifetime. Prince Albert died in this room, and Victoria gave instructions in the days immediately after his death that the room was to be kept exactly as it was. Not repurposed, not redone, kept. For 40 years, servants came to the Blue Room every day. They changed the water in the jugs, they laid out the shaving things, they kept the linens fresh, they maintained the fiction that the room was in use because Victoria required that fiction, not because she had lost her grip on reality. She was, throughout her widowhood, one of the most politically effective monarchs in British history, managing an empire with the combination of inherited instinct and accumulated experience that no one who'd watched her from the outside had quite expected. But because some part of what she needed was to have a room where Albert still existed, where the ordinary maintenance of his daily life continued even if he did not, this is grief doing something interesting, something very human and not at all dignified, and also entirely understandable if you let yourself get close enough to it. Victoria dressed in black from the day of Albert's death to the day of her own. She did not attend public functions for years. She was criticised for it, accused of withdrawing from her duties, of using grief as a shield against the demands of queenship. The criticism was not entirely unfair. She was also not entirely wrong to make the trade she made. She had been, with Albert, a person in a full and particular way. She had been his wife, which meant something specific to her, physical, emotional, daily, real. Without him she was only queen, and queen was not, for Victoria, enough. The separate bed movement, with its twin bedsteads and its matching headboards, and its confident medical endorsements, had very little to say about any of this. It was organised around the idea that the right sleeping arrangement would optimise health, and social standing, and domestic efficiency. And all of those things are real, but they are not the thing that Victoria was holding on to. She was holding on to the fact that she had been known by one specific person in one specific room over one specific span of years, known in the particular way that only shared sleep allows, the way that comes from lying beside someone in the dark and learning, slowly and without trying, how they breathe, how they move, what they sound like when they dream, how the room feels different with them in it, and how the room feels with them gone. The separate bed movement was, in the end, a solution to the wrong problem. It solved for health, for convenience, for propriety. What it didn't solve for was the simple human thing that Victoria spent 40 years grieving, the irreplaceable and entirely ordinary fact of another person beside you in the dark, who is, of course, exactly what she'd lost. The separate bed was practical, it was fashionable, it was medically endorsed and architecturally convenient and socially aspirational. All of those things were real, but underneath all of those things, underneath the Heel and Son catalogues and the Dr. Richardson pamphlets and the matched bedsteads in the Paris exhibition, was a question that no piece of furniture can fully answer. What do you want? And what people wanted, as it turned out, was not always what the doctors prescribed. The 20th century would eventually prove this in the most comprehensive way possible, but it would take time. 2 world wars, a cultural revolution, and the deliberate commercial rebranding of an entire domestic arrangement before the double bed came back. And how it came back is almost as interesting as how it left. There was a period, roughly the 1910s and 1920s, when the twin bed had become so settled and ordinary that it ceased to signify anything at all. It was furniture, background furniture, the kind of thing that appeared in a bedroom not because anyone had decided anything, but because that was simply what bedrooms contained. The original arguments for it, the electromagnetic vitality, the danger of shared breath, had quietly faded from popular consciousness. Nobody was citing Dr. Richardson at dinner parties anymore. The separate bed had won, and having won, it became invisible. This is what happens to most successful reforms. The thing they were arguing for gets normalized, and in getting normalized gets stripped of its argument. You don't need to explain why people have separate plates at dinner. You don't need to justify the existence of a second bed. These things simply are. The ideology that created them dissolves into the assumption that this is just how things work. What's interesting about the twin bed era is that even as it became the unremarkable default, it still retained, under the surface just barely visible, its association with a certain kind of correctness. Having separate beds was not discussed, but the couple who suddenly moved to a shared bed in the 1920s would have noticed that their friends noticed. The shared bed by this point was slightly transgressive, not shocking, but slightly conspicuous, as if you'd made a choice that required a small explanation you weren't quite giving. The stigma had flipped, barely, tentatively, before the war came and scrambled everything again. But it had begun to flip, and once a stigma begins to flip, it is very difficult to stop. By the 1920s, as we've noted, twin beds in the middle-class home were entirely unremarkable. They were the default. They appeared in magazines, in advertisements, in the background of photographs without comment or explanation. Two beds, of course. What else? The change came slowly, and then quickly, and it came from several directions at once. The first was demographic. The 2 world wars compressed living space, shifted family structures, and created new housing patterns. The suburban expansion of the 1940s and 1950s, rows of new houses in new developments, built quickly and to standard plans, often included smaller bedrooms than the Victorian townhouse. A room sized for 2 twin beds could fit 1 double bed instead, with space left over. The practical arithmetic of smaller rooms quietly began to favour the shared bed. The second was cultural. The post-war world was constructing a new ideal of marriage. Romantic, companionate, emotionally intimate and explicitly physical, in ways that Victorian domestic ideology had never quite managed to accommodate. The war had separated couples. Returning to each other was, in that context, a reunion in the most literal possible sense. The shared bed carried a meaning it hadn't carried in the 1890s. It meant you were together again. You had survived. You were home. The third force was Hollywood, and this one is more complicated than it appears. The Hays Code, the set of content restrictions that governed American cinema from 1934 to 1968, required that married couples in films be depicted sleeping in separate beds, not identical beds, separate beds with a gap between them. The reasoning was proprietary modesty. A shared bed implied what happened in it, and what happened in it was not for the screen. So for 3.5 decades, every married couple in American film slept in twin beds, with a bedside table between them like a moat. The effect of this was unexpected, because by consistently showing twin beds as the married arrangement, Hollywood normalized them. even as the culture outside the cinema was moving towards shared beds. And when the Hays Code began to loosen, and eventually to collapse, the shared bed reappeared on screen with the quality of something transgressive, something new, something romantic, the thing you were finally allowed to see, which meant that by the time twin beds disappeared from the films, they'd already acquired the faint smell of the old-fashioned. The shared bed was modern. The shared bed was intimate. The shared bed was what you had when you were really together, really close, really in love. And the furniture industry, which had spent 50 years selling twin beds as the modern choice, reoriented itself with impressive speed and began selling the double bed as the modern choice. Same industry, different product, same pitch. This is what forward-thinking people who love each other do. None of this happened because the science changed. The science had already changed. The electromagnetic vitality theory had quietly been abandoned by the medical mainstream without much fanfare, the way most wrong ideas eventually are. But the science changing was not what shifted behaviour. The culture shifted behaviour. The stories people told about what they wanted shifted behaviour. And the furniture industry, correctly identifying which direction the wind was blowing, shifted its catalogues. The next time you make your bed in the morning, smoothing down the covers, arranging the pillows, doing the small habitual thing that billions of people do in some form every single day, it might be worth knowing that the arrangement you're smoothing is itself a historical artifact, an argument someone once made and won, a fashion that replaced another fashion, the visible surface of decisions that were made long ago by doctors and furniture makers and grieving queens and people leaning on ropes in the dark. All of it is there, underneath the ordinary morning. All of it led in its complicated and entirely non-linear way to this. Consider this. According to surveys conducted in the United States in the early 2020s, somewhere between 25 and 30% of couples regularly sleep apart, some in separate rooms, some in separate beds, some by choice, some by necessity. A partner who snores, a child who needs one parent in the night, a sleep schedule so different that sharing a bed means neither person sleeps well. The reasons are modern. The arrangement is not. Without knowing it, roughly a quarter of American couples are sleeping in a way that Heel and Son would have considered entirely sensible, that Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson would have approved of, that a significant portion of the Victorian middle class would have recognised as the obvious, progressive, medically educated choice. They are doing what their great-great-grandparents were told to do, and most of them feel, to some degree, vaguely embarrassed about it. This shame is itself historically new. It is worth looking at directly, because it tells you something important about how thoroughly the cultural meaning of the shared bed was rebuilt in the 20th century. The term sleep divorce entered popular usage sometime around 2015. It spread through wellness journalism, relationship advice columns, and eventually into more mainstream coverage. And the framing was always the same. You and your partner sleeping apart is a compromise, a concession, a workaround. Something you do when the ideal arrangement, together, close, in the same bed every night, has turned out to be incompatible with actual sleep. The ideal remains the shared bed. The sleep divorce is the failure to achieve it. This framing would have baffled Dr. Richardson. It would have alarmed the team at Heel and Son. It would have struck Baroness Staff, with her emphasis on the personal dressing room as a sanctuary for the inner life, as an extraordinary inversion of everything she believed about the relationship between privacy and well-being. But it is the framing we have, and it is surprisingly durable. Sleep researchers in the 21st century have been quietly building an evidence base that complicates this framing considerably. Studies conducted at several universities have found that couples who sleep apart report better quality sleep by almost every metric. Fewer awakenings, more restorative sleep, lower levels of reported sleep disturbance. Some of these studies found that better rested partners also reported feeling more positively about their relationships, not despite sleeping apart, possibly because of it. The research is not definitive. Sleep science is genuinely complex, and the interaction between sleep quality and relationship satisfaction involves variables that are difficult to disentangle. But the direction of the findings is interesting, because it suggests that the Victorian doctors, who were wrong about almost all of the specific mechanisms they identified, may have been tracking something real in the outcome they recommended. Separate sleep might, in fact, be better for many people, not because of electromagnetic fields, because of sleep. There is a country that has arrived at this conclusion independently and made it simply and practically part of its domestic culture, without any of the Victorian medical drama or the mid-century romantic rebranding. In Scandinavia, and particularly in the Nordic countries, the convention of separate duvets in a shared bed is commonplace. 2 people, 1 bed, 2 individual duvets, no negotiation over the covers, no one cold because someone else has wrapped the blanket around themselves at 3 a.m, each person warm in their own way, in their own space, sharing the bed without sharing the thermal management of the night. It is such a practical, unromantic solution that it feels almost startling when you hear it described. Of course, why not? Who said 2 people needed to share 1 blanket? The blanket is not the relationship. The warmth is yours. The warmth is theirs. The bed holds both. There is probably a lesson in this about the difference between the symbol of an arrangement and its function. The shared bed, in its modern romantic incarnation, is meaningful because it represents togetherness. 2 people under 1 set of covers, close enough to touch, choosing proximity. But the covers and the touching are separate things. You can have the touching without the shared blanket. You can have the proximity without the thermal competition. The symbol and the function can be separated, and when you separate them, you often find that the function was doing most of the work all along. This is in some ways the Victorian discovery repackaged. The separate bed, or the separate duvet, is not a statement about emotional distance. It is a statement about what bodies need in order to rest. And bodies, it turns out, have opinions about this that are not entirely compatible with what culture tells us we should want. The separate bed movement was wrong about electromagnetic fields, but it was right that the body at rest is doing something that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. That sleep is not just the pause between useful hours, that the conditions of sleep matter, that what happens in the 8 hours when you're unconscious has effects that ripple through the other 16, and that an arrangement that optimizes for the symbol of intimacy at the expense of the quality of rest might be costing more than it is worth. The Victorians drew the wrong conclusions from the right observation. We drew the right conclusions about togetherness, but forgot to think seriously about sleep. And somewhere in the distance between those 2 errors is the actual answer, which is probably, as most actual answers are, more personal and more variable and less photogenic than either of the confident positions on either side. Every generation decides what the natural sleeping arrangement is. Every generation decides this with tremendous confidence, and every generation is, at least in part, simply doing what it was sold. The Victorians were sold the twin bed, we were sold the double. Future generations will be sold something else, possibly a return to something older, possibly something entirely new. The companies will describe it as progressive, the doctors will endorse it, the magazines will run features about it, and the people who adopt it will feel, genuinely, that they have made the modern, forward-thinking, obviously correct choice. This has always been how it works. This is how it will always work. The bed is not neutral. It never has been. It is the place where we are most ourselves, most unguarded, most vulnerable, most outside the performance of the day, and so everything we believe about it. Who should be in it? How many people, in what arrangement, in what kind of room, carries a weight that is entirely out of proportion to its surface simplicity. It is just a bed. It is everything we can't quite say out loud about what we want from the people we love. And so, for tonight, we can set all of that down, the history, the theories, the furniture catalogues and the medical pamphlets and the plaster cast of a hand, the tenement room and the service corridor and the boudoir where a woman sat up at midnight with a candle and a book that no one knew she was reading. Set it down. It will be there tomorrow. Right now, the only thing that needs your attention is the room you are in. Let it get a little quieter around you. If you are lying down, feel the weight of where you are. The bed beneath you. Your bed, yours, in the way that beds are yours when they have held you long enough to know the particular shape of how you sleep. The pillow under your head, the particular give of it, the warmth that has already gathered around you, the way warmth does when a body has been still long enough to build it. You don't have to do anything with that. Just feel it. You've been carrying a great deal tonight. Not just the day, all of it. The history, the rooms, the people we visited together in the dark of the past, the woman reading by candlelight at 1 a.m, the doctor at his desk writing with great confidence about things he didn't quite understand, the children laid sideways across a bed too small for them, the Queen sleeping beside the shape of her husband's hand for 40 years. All of that is in you now, in the way that things become part of you when you've spent time with them, not as information, as something quieter than that, as a kind of knowing that doesn't require you to do anything with it, or say it out loud, or turn it into an opinion. Just know it. Just let it sit where it's sitting. Your body knows how to do this. It has been doing it every night, without you, for your whole life. The slow process of absorption and release that sleep makes possible, the way the mind, freed from the requirement to be useful, begins to process everything it didn't have time for during the hours when usefulness was required. The way a body that has been held upright all day begins, in the horizontal dark, to find its actual weight. You have an actual weight. Right now, you are finding it. Feel the contact between yourself and the bed. The places where your body presses down, your heels, if you're lying on your back, your hips, your shoulders, the back of your head against the pillow. These are the places where the weight collects. Let it be there. Let the bed hold it. That is what the bed is for. Not just sleeping, holding. Taking the weight of a day that was carried by a body that is now still, in a room that is its own, in the quiet that comes when everything else has stopped asking something of you. This is what every person we talked about tonight was trying to get to, in their different ways, with their different resources, inside their different constraints. The Victorian woman in her private room, the working man lying down when his body finally gave out, the Queen lying beside what she'd lost, still trying to feel what had been there, even Dr. Richardson with his single bed system, Even he was trying to protect something. The restorative possibility of a body at rest in a space that was safe. Rest is not a modern invention. The need for it is not a modern luxury. It is as old as the first body that lay down in the dark and let the night be the night. Older than language, older than medicine, older than furniture. You are part of that long line. Right now, in this room, in this bed, you are in a tradition of rest that is longer than any history I could tell you, and you belong in it entirely, without needing to earn it or justify it or explain it to anyone. Just be here. Somewhere in your body there is the weight of the day. You've been carrying it since this morning, through everything that happened, through everything you did and said and thought and worried about and let go of and picked back up again. It's still there, or some of it is. Let it start to soften, not disappear, just soften. The way things do in the quiet when you stop needing them to be sharp. We were in a Victorian bedroom tonight. You know that room now. The dark wallpaper, the heavy curtains, the fire going low in the grate. 2 beds, or 1, depending on who lived there and what they believed and what they needed. And on the mantelpiece, a candle. The candle is still there, not in your room, in the room we visited, but you can carry it. That small, steady flame on the mantelpiece burning lower as the night goes on, making the light move on the ceiling in that particular way, slow and unhurried, the way light moves when no one is asking it to hurry. A woman lay awake watching it once. She had a book, or a letter she was writing, or just her thoughts, quiet and her own, in a room that no one would enter without knocking. The candle burned. The house was still. The night held her. Let the night hold you too. Your breath is already slower than it was. You may have noticed. Or you may not have noticed, which is fine. That's what the body does when you give it a moment. It begins to return to itself. The breath finds its own pace, slower and a little deeper, without you doing anything to make that happen. Just let it. The room around you is quieter now, or it feels quieter. The thoughts that were loud a few minutes ago have moved back a little, the way sounds do when you stop paying attention to them. They haven't gone. They'll be there tomorrow, but tonight they don't need you. Nothing needs you right now. The candle on the mantelpiece is lower than it was. The flame is small and steady. The room is very dark at the edges, the corners already absorbed into the night, and only the centre of the room still holds a little light. Just a little. Just enough. Enough. Somewhere, a long time ago, a woman closed her eyes in a room like this. She'd been afraid sometimes, and uncertain, and tired in ways that had no clean name. She'd wanted things she couldn't say plainly. She had loved people as well as she knew how. She had done what the day asked and then come back to this room, this closed door, this small private dark, and she had slept. The candle burned lower. The light on the ceiling slowed. The house was quiet. She was held. You are held. The breath is slow now. The body is heavy and warm and already beginning to do the thing it does when everything else has stopped. The thing it has been doing every night, in some form, in some bed, in some arrangement that someone at some point decided was the right one. For as long as there have been people and darkness and the need to rest. The candle is very low now. Just a little light. Just enough. Let it go. Just the warmth, the weight, the quiet. The room was still then, and the room is still now. The candle, the dark. You are here. You're safe. Sleep. I'll be here when you wake up. Somewhere in the comments there are people writing down where they are and what time it is, and I read every single one. If you want to be one of them, I'd love that. you'd be in good company. People have left their quiet little notes from every time zone in the world, in every season, at every hour of the night. And if you want more nights like this one, more history, more stories, more rooms from the past that somehow say something about right now, subscribe, stay close. The room was quiet then. It is quiet now. Good night.